Check, check, check. There it is. All right, good evening, everyone. It is nice to see everyone here. Thanks for coming out. Before we get into the seminar itself, let's talk about the schedule of what this is going to look like tonight. Our first session is going to be basically, it's going to be the facts. What do you need to know about these issues? It's going to, I clocked it today at right around 53 minutes. Okay, so if I run out of water, someone just throw a water bottle at me, and I'll be fine. Then we're going to take, like a 5-10 minute break in between, and then we'll come back for session 2. After session 2 is kind of the application, right? Like, okay, we have the information. What do we do with this information now? That's more closer to like 40 minutes. And then after that will be question and answer time. For I'd say most of us here are Cheyenne people. And so for you all, some of this first lesson in particular is you're going to be like, I feel like I've heard this before, because you have. Okay. I don't want to say a large portion, maybe half of this first session was just taken directly from my sermon a few weeks ago. So, but there's a bunch of stuff that I originally had to remove because I didn't want to preach a 53-minute sermon. And so this is the full thing. So don't tune it out just because you're like, oh, I've heard this before. There's a lot of stuff that is put back in here. And so that's the schedule. Now, what is this seminar? What are we doing here tonight? What are we planning on doing? And maybe the best way to answer that question is to tell you what this is not. Tonight, we are not here to try to stand up or overthrow the school board. We were going to be talking about that, about schools, and what is being taught in schools, but that's not the primary focus. We're not here to change public policy. We're actually not here to talk politics at all. And so that is not what this is going to be about. Tonight's subject matter is people. We're here because we love people, and that is the kind of the main idea here. We're going to be talking about relationships. Parents, how do we talk to our kids about these important and yet challenging subjects? How do we talk to our friends, young people who are here tonight, who might be watching this? How do you talk to your friends about this? And as church members, how do we become a better church to address these topics? The public policy stuff, you can let your voice be heard in the voting booths, right? Like you should be doing that, and we actually saw that in our community over this last year. That people were like, you know what, we don't like what's going on, and so let's make some changes, and it happened, and it did happen. But what do we do in the meantime? Because regardless of what the school board looks like or what our politics look like, our kids are still kids, and they're still growing up, and they're still being affected by this stuff. And so absolutely, let's get out and vote, and let's make our voices heard. But in the meantime, we need to be prepared and equipped to handle these topics. Or, I mean, it isn't crazy to think that our society continues to just go in this direction. And as much as we might want to make change, what happens if we can't? Then what do we do? Well, we have to be prepared. This seminar, I hope, it will be an equipping type of tool for you, giving you the information you need to make informed decisions and to help you explain any or all of what we talk about tonight to your kids or grandkids or kids in the church or whoever you might be talking to. They are the ones who are most at risk, and they are the ones who are being most affected by these issues today. I will be addressing this from a purely Christian perspective, just so you know. We're going to be using the Bible as our moral compass, and we're going to be taking Jesus' lead in how to interact with these people. So, we start with session 1. Here we are. What do you need to know? What are the issues? We're going to be going all over the place. This first session might feel like drinking out of a fire hose. And even still at the end of 53 minutes, we're still not going to have covered everything in this subject. But hopefully this will give you a good starting point, and will lead us into our next session. If you're watching the news, you can't help but see transgender, homosexuality, sexual identity issues popping up everywhere, right? You think about trans women invading women's sports. Think about brands like Budweiser and Nike that are using trans people to show just how woke they are. Parents having to constantly battle public policy and the school system to keep sexually explicit LGBTQ material from reaching their children. And of course, June is now Pride Month. We are surrounded by this information. We cannot escape it. It's just, in front of our faces so often. Even if you don't watch the news, it still finds its way to you. And like, this is the world that we are now living in. How did we end up here? I think we could point to all sorts of things, all sorts of reasons why we are here. Is it the LGBTQ agenda in children's TV programming? Maybe. Is it the liberal colleges that we send our kids to? Maybe. Is it Hollywood? And the role that they are playing in this movement? Or is it the flashy and outrageous nature of this lifestyle? We saw in the pandemic, some people point to that because it seems like, the pandemic came and we all hibernated in our houses for a few months, and then we got bored, and suddenly all of these new terms and acronyms and things just kind of sprouted out of there, and it's like, where did this come from? Well, during the COVID times, we saw depression and anxiety spike, especially among young people. But we shouldn't be surprised, regardless of where this came from or how this happened. We shouldn't be surprised, because as Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. And if you're thinking, well, it's never been this bad. I know, back in the 90s it was like this, and back in the 80s it was like that, but it's never been, quite as bad as it is now. Well, we need to kind of refocus our compass and realize that this has been happening in the history of the world over and over and over again. Paul dealt with it in his time in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 27. It's a long section. I'm going to read the whole of it and just see how this fits with our world today. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged the natural relations for those that were contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. Paul just as easily could have been writing about our time. It shows, if we think, well, it's never been this bad, if you go back in history, things have gotten pretty bad. But it all starts with suppressing the truth. That's where Paul started in verse 18, right at the end there. He says, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Well, what truth is he talking about there? The truth, he goes on to explain that the observable world around us points to there being a God, a creator. That when you look around, you can't deny it. And when we suppress that truth, it leads us into all sorts of darkness. And when we exchange the truth for a lie and worship that instead, and so then truth becomes nothing, and things that were once thought to be indisputable are now up for debate, and things that were once rock-solid facts are now fluid. And gender and sexuality to the world is whatever you want it to be. And because of that fact, because of what we just read, and because our children are being affected, because our country is more divided than it ever has been, and because God's word is being trampled upon at every turn, so often our response is outrage. And it's easy to do it. You look in the headlines you see that come across your Facebook feeds, and it's just, I don't understand. Why would someone want to do this to their own bodies? That's disgusting. We vilify anyone who identifies or supports it, and then we make our disgust known on social media. There are two dangerous trends when it comes to the sexuality and gender conversation, and they might not be what you are thinking. The first trend is becoming a culture warrior. What do I mean by that? These are the soldiers that really care less about actual trans people. Their only interest is to disprove the transgender ideologies they read about in the clickbait headlines. They read only certain tirades mocking the views of trans activists, and they feel satisfying warmth of winning an argument as you live vicariously through your favorite political pundit. Meanwhile, little do they know that the person they sit next to in church every week secretly struggles with their own gender identity. They have no one to talk to, and they experience church not as a hospital for sinners, but as a graveyard for the marginalized. And that is not what we are here to do tonight. We're not here to become culture warriors and to poke and make fun of other people's pain. The second trend is in response to the first trend, and that is to become a lover, not a thinker. The response is, well, I'm not going to pick a side. I'm just going to love people, period. And whereas true, we need to be loving towards people, the response is, well, I don't need to bother with all of the theological or the scientific complexities. Well, the harsh reality is that empathy without thought can do damage as well. Loving people but turning our brains off can only indulge their fantasy. And sometimes compassion without thinking can move you to do things that in the short run make a person feel good, but in the long run can cause an awful lot of harm. We're not here to be on either sides of the pendulum tonight. We want to be lovers and thinkers. We want to stand up for the truth, but not put people down in our efforts to do so. So, with that being said, let's just take a breath, because I need it. Let's take a breath and remember what Jesus said to Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, in Luke 19, 9 through 10. He said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, since he also is a son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Let's take a breath and remember what Jesus said to the prostitute. In Luke chapter 7, verse 47, it says, "Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but he who has forgiven little loves little." Let's remember what Jesus said to yet another tax collector, Matthew, when he was calling him to be a disciple in Luke chapter 5. It says, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Before we dive into this topic too far, we need to remember that those people, whatever those people are in our lives, are still people. There are people that are made in the image of God, and there are people that Jesus wants to save. We need to remember that the kingdom that Jesus is building is one where people who have lived their entire lives in darkness and have had their minds and their bodies shaped by that darkness are now called into the light. And we're called to love them. We're called to love the alcoholic and the drug addict. We're called to love the divorced, the thief, the liar, the sex addicted. We're called to love the Democrat and the Republican. And yes, we're even called to love the trans person. And that doesn't mean that we condone their practices. And it doesn't mean that we compromise the truth. But it does mean when those around us fall short of that truth, we have compassion for them and love them with our brains turned on. The easiest way to love someone is to learn about them. Learn about what their likes are, what their hobbies are, and what their struggles are. And it's no different with this population, the LGBTQ population. We need to learn about them. As uncomfortable as it might make us, we still need to do that. Language, when it comes to this debate and this topic, is essential to understanding the conversation. But the list of terms just grows with every day, right? It's like LGBTQ, like it just keeps adding on to it, and it's hard to keep up with. But we need to do our best if we're going to try to reach these people. And so we won't cover every term, but here are some of the big terms that we need to know. And we'll start with an easy one: homosexual, gay, lesbian. When I was a kid, this was the only other sexuality that I knew of growing up. And even then it was like you just didn't really, when I was a small child, didn't hear about it at all. When I was a teenager, in the early 2000s, way back in the early 2000s, I think there was one kid in my high school that had come out as gay, and that was it. I mean, you think about that, and some of you were kids before the early 2000s. I can only imagine what it was. It was just like, it was unheard of, right? It was just like, it was just not done. But what are these terms? Well, it simply means that their sexual preferences for the same sex. That is easy. It only gets much more complicated from here. So let's go to transgender. What is that? Transgender is an umbrella term for the many ways in which people might experience and or present and express their gender identities differently from those whose sense of gender identity is congruent with their biological sex. What does that mean? That was a long definition to basically mean people who feel out of place in the body that they were born with. That's all that means. And the key term here is umbrella. Umbrella, I mean, this covers a large variety of different orientations and different words and sexualities that all would be under the umbrella term of transgender. All the way from just a man who doesn't feel very masculine, Maybe they're into more traditionally feminine hobbies or colors that they like or clothes that they wear. That could be considered transgender. Or all the way to the other side of the spectrum where someone who is suffering from severe gender dysphoria, they feel like they are in the wrong body and it causes them psychological and physical pain. That's transgender. Non-binary refers to a wide range of gender identities that are not exclusively male or female. Binary means one of two, right? If you know computer code, that's binary because it's all ones and zeros, ones and zeros, right? And it's only ever one of those two options. In binary code, you never get a 2 or a 3 or a 5. It's only a 1 or a 0. And how that fits with this is that when it comes to our sex, it's either male or female, typically. And if someone doesn't feel like they fit one of those two categories, then they are considered non-binary. Other terms for this include genderqueer, gender fluid, and pangender. Gender dysphoria. This is a psychological term for the distress some people feel when their internal sense of self doesn't match their biological sex. This is a diagnosis. This is a mental health disorder. It's in the DSM-5. It can be diagnosed to certain people, although I don't know any counselor or therapist today that would risk actually diagnosing someone with this. When I was in my master's program for counseling, I asked when we were going through diagnosis in one of our classes, I asked, how do you diagnose someone with gender dysphoria today in the climate that we're currently in? And her response was, I don't know. It's very, it makes you feel good as a student. Like, all right, teacher doesn't even know. Cool. So I would not be shocked at all if when the DSM-6 comes out, if this one is just gone. Because this behavior is now normalized within our culture. Gender dysphoria can range from mild to severe. It can come in waves, or it can kind of buzz steadily in the background of someone's mind. It can cause physical distress to someone and psychological distress as well.
I think it's diagnostic statistical
manual disorders, right?
They use it in mental health agencies.
Yes, it's DSM. It's DSM-5.
They use it for mental health for
Yeah,
diagnosis.
yeah, just the manual of disorders, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's the DSM-5 is like the DSM-4, 3, 2, 1 is the manual. They all have codes on them of all of the mental health disorders that ever can be diagnosed. Many of them never are, and it goes into like all of the criteria that someone needs to meet to fit a certain diagnosis. Its main purpose, because we live in a society of insurance, is so that the insurance company knows what is going on and what is being billed for, and stuff like that. I know statistics were in there somewhere. Yeah, I graduated, so I don't have to remember that stuff anymore. I'm done. Yeah. Transition. Transition can be done in one of three ways, or all three ways at the same time: social, hormonal, and surgical. Social transition would be something akin to changing your name. That would be a social transition. From a male name to a female name, or changing the way that you dress from traditionally male clothes to traditionally female clothes. It can be that easy. Hormonal transition is someone who starts taking pills of the opposite sex's hormones, and then they start exhibiting some changes. Some can be reversed. some cannot. Surgical is actually going under the knife. All of these changes cannot be reverted. And I think this is the, if someone asks, why do we need a class like this? Why do we need to learn about stuff like this? Well, as we go on through our seminar tonight and realize just how many kids that this is affecting in our world today, and people who are going so far as to start, chopping off body parts, there is a very good chance, a high likelihood, that there's going to be people that are going to be coming through our doors that are, legitimately seeking Christ, that are going to look different than what we think they should look like. Because detransitioning, like I said, social, that's easy. Hormonal, some of those changes can be reverted, some of them cannot. All of the surgical ones cannot be reverted. Also called gender confirmation surgery or sex reassignment surgery. And this one, I think if any, this might be the one that triggers people, and that is trans man, trans woman, and cisgender. A trans man is someone who is a biological female but identifies as a male. A trans woman is a biological male who now identifies as a woman. And cisgender is kind of a new term. We would just call this man and woman before. Now, because of all of these terms, right? Like, how do you describe someone who is born a certain sex and remains a certain sex? Like I said, we would just call that man and woman. Like, that's too simple now. And so now, those of us who identify with the sex that we were born with, we're cis men or cis women. Not saying that you have to use that terminology, but we are here to educate ourselves, right? Intersex. So the intersex is a person who is born with the sexual anatomy and or chromosomes of both sexes. This is someone who has the equipment of both sexes. Sometimes that can be fully or partially. Sometimes that is not actually something that is seen, but they maybe have an extra chromosome in their DNA. Sometimes that causes physical changes, sometimes it doesn't. But all of those would qualify someone to be intersex, and this is typically for the people who are pro-transgender, this is their bastion. This is where they you see, this is just how people are, and so gender is now fluid. Speaking of gender, sex and gender are the two big terms when it comes to this conversation. When I was growing up, sex and gender were synonyms. They meant the same thing. Now they do not. These are the two most important concepts for this conversation, and for us to understand what people are talking about when they say, that my gender is fluid. I'm pretty sure it's not, because that sounds pretty painful. And I don't know anyone that would be able to live like that. It's because we're talking about two different things. Let's start with sex. Not talking about intercourse, although intercourse plays a part in this. Because what sex is for Homo sapiens, that's us, we are sexually dimorphic. Congratulations. You are sexually dimorphic. What does that mean? It means that reproduction in our species happens when the gamete of one individual and the gamete of another individual meet and a new individual is formed. That is Health Class 101, right? Sperm meets the egg and a new person is formed. And the classifications for those two individuals for Homo sapiens is male and female. And it's for the process, for the purpose of reproduction. A person's sex is made up of four things: the presence or absence of a Y chromosome, internal reproductive organs, external sexual anatomy, and endocrine systems that produce secondary sex characteristics. All of this, what I just said about sex, can be found in any biology book. It's not like, they're hiding this from people. They're not. Because all this stuff about sex is not widely disputed. This is basic science. The American Psychological Association, which is typically a pretty far left-leaning organization as far as politically, even they define sex as this. It refers to a person's biological status and is typically categorized as male, female, or intersex. There are a number of indicators of biological sex, including sex chromosomes, gonads, internal reproductive organs, and external genitalia. Everything that I just said, right? Like we agree. We agree on all of that, right? It's not widely disputed. And our interpretations of sex might be socially constructed, but sex itself is not. It can't be. It's biology, right? And that's what we would say to people that are in the transgender population. We would say, like, it's biology. I don't understand. What do you mean that you can be different genders all at the same time? Like it's biology, and that's because we typically are talking about sex, whereas they are talking about gender. And that brings us to gender. You hear this phrase, at least I do, all the time, that gender is a social construct. Gender is a social construct. And it's like, what do you mean? I'm pretty sure when Adam and Eve came on the scene, like, they didn't invent it, right? It's like, and then every other person that has ever lived, they didn't, come out of the womb and invent something new. It's always been male and female. If you've ever heard that or gotten upset, you're not the only one. And what you need to know is that many social science researchers, college professors, and the trans people themselves view sex and gender as two separate things. They mean something totally different. It started in the late 1960s, where sex and gender were used to describe two different things. And so here is the definition of gender: a psychological, social, and cultural aspects of being male or female. So it's in your mind, it's how you interact with other people, and it's how groups of people interact with each other. Nothing in that definition has anything to do with biology. And that is where the communication breakdown typically occurs. It's because one group is talking about one thing and one is talking about another, and we think sex and gender are synonyms where they don't. Gender then is broken down into two parts: gender roles and gender identity. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of self. This is how they view themselves. This is how they identify. Gender roles are based more on social and cultural expectations. Basically, are you masculine? Are you feminine? And we need to explain these more too. Gender roles, let's start with that. Also called gender stereotypes. Basically, men doing manly things and girls doing girly things. But the question is, who decides what's manly? And who decides what's girly? Is it like hardwired into our brains of like, this has just always been a manly thing because this is what men do? Or is it culture saying, well, this is what we think is feminine, and then that changes? Well, there is examples on both sides. This is the 1918 edition of the Ladies' Home Journal, which apparently there's a war going on or something back in 1918. It was over 100 years ago. There was a war going on, if you didn't know. Over 100 years ago, the pink was a manly color and blue was a feminine color. In this issue, they say, quote, "Pink, being a more decided and stronger color, is more suitable for a boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl." 100 years later, it's flip-flopped. Who decided that? Who did that? Just people, right? It's culture. One guy decided one day, I'm going to wear blue. And even if they laugh at me, I'm going to wear it proudly. And then another guy wears it, another guy, and before long it is flip-flopped completely. And the same thing happens today. I remember when I was a kid, pink was just like, no. Pink, purples, fuchsias, salmons, whatever. No, absolutely not. But now that I am stronger and more decided in my life, bring them on. Yeah, I'll wear any color. So, that's how culture works. That's how the nurture part works. On the other side, there's the nature, the mindset that, well, these things are just baked into us. They're hardwired in our brains. And the poster boy for the nature side of this debate is a man named David Reimer. Born in 1965, when he was just a few days old, little David was marred in a botched circumcision. Hardly any of his genitalia was left. And so the doctor advised the parents that it would be better for him if they just removed all of the genitalia entirely, and then they would just raise him as a girl. So the parents took the advice of the doctor and did exactly that. Little David became little Brenda, and they raised him as a girl. But as he grew up, the parents and David himself would say that he struggled. He struggled with a lot. He would rip off the frilly dresses in favor of jeans. He would throw aside the dolls in favor for guns. And when he was 14 years old, he came to his parents and told them that he wanted to transition to be a boy, because he just felt more like he was a boy. And then his parents had to tell him, well, you are. And talk about awkward conversation. Or like feeling like you're in a Twilight Zone episode of like, what is going on? And then they did that. He transitioned to being a boy and grew up the rest of his life. And as far as I know, he's still alive being a boy. So if someone says that their body doesn't match their gender, and by gender they mean gender role, it means that they don't feel like they fit the cultural or societal mold of what it means to be a man or woman. But then we get to gender identity. And this is kind of a grab bag of whatever you want it to be. And this is the area where you probably see all of the salacious and clickbaity titles of stuff going on. Typically it's all in this realm of gender identity, because it's much more fluid than gender roles. When truth goes out the window, things like identity become a moving target, and people's gender identity changes with the wind. And when asked, how many gender identities are there? The response is hundreds. And when asked, well, how do you determine which identity you are? The response is, well, you get to choose. So now we're basically throwing darts at the proverbial dartboard, and just wherever you land, that's what you are. If you don't like it, throw another dart. Throw multiple darts. Become the dart. Become the board. There's no science. There's no logic. There's no rules. And so if you're saying to yourself, when it comes to gender identity, I don't get it. I don't get it. Well, not many do. Even the ones that claim to be transgender. It's just like, it's this like unknown, unwritten, rule and feeling out there, and you just kind of know it when you know it. Here's the more troubling part of the gender debate today. There is this, they've termed it rapid onset gender dysphoria, or ROGD. In many Western countries, we have seen a rapid spike in the number of teens questioning their gender. That's not news. That's like, yeah. It seems like I said, when
when I was a kid, there was one guy in my high school that had come out as gay, but the idea, the concept of being transgender wasn't even a thing, wasn't even thought of. The main gender clinic in the United Kingdom in 2009, this was only 5 years after I graduated high school, treated 51 teens with gender dysphoria. The entire year, only 51. You flash forward 7 years, 1,766 were treated with gender dysphoria. You flash forward 3 years after that, it's 2,364. That's a 5,000% increase in 10 years. That's not normal, right? That's any way you slice it, any way you look at these numbers, anyone with a brain would ask the question, what is going on? Why all of a sudden are we seeing this huge, and it's not just like a little blip, it's just pretty much a vertical line that's only going up. We see a similar trend in Sweden, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Canada, and of course, the United States. It's called rapid onset because most of these kids announce that they are trans in a way that seems quite sudden to their parents and their counselors, meaning they never really showed any previous transgender tendencies before, and it just kind of happened. It came out of nowhere. In a 2018 study on ROGD, Lisa Littman wrote about the common factors that connected all the kids that she was researching. And here they are. A few of the children showed any signs of gender dysphoria to their parents growing up. Their new identity seemed to appear out of the blue. Many, if not all, of their friends at school were trans. Many of them became more popular after they came out as trans. They engaged in heavy online and social media activity, and many of them had other mental health concerns that were being dealt with. Littman said in her study that the majority of kids in her study thought that transitioning would solve all of their problems. And many became unwilling to work on basic mental health issues before seeking treatment. A common theme in Littman's findings was the role that societal influence plays on young people, especially females. That same gender clinic in the United Kingdom, over those years, it was a 1,460% increase for boys. For girls, it was over 5,000% increase. Why do you think it's more prevalent in girls?
Any thoughts? I need a drink. Yeah, Abigail?
Because they feel like they have no power as a woman, and
by
transitioning to be a man, they can have more power in society.
Gotcha. Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Aaron?
I also think there's a strong sense of belonging during those forming years of like puberty. You know, if a lot of your friends are going there and they're being more popular, they're getting more popularity afterwards, and that might become more desirable.
Yeah.
I remember growing up, when I was a kid back in the day, it was the really big struggle that a lot of girls, teenagers, my age were having. It was like a pandemic all over the country. Was anorexia. Do you remember those times of just like I remember watching several videos in school about, it was like a girl looking in the mirror and she saw herself as being really big, but then it like changed around and she was just like, you know, skin and bones, literally skin and bones. Girls, this is what Littman said, for a long time struggled with image. And so eating disorders and body dysmorphia are much more prevalent in girls than they are in boys. And this is what Littman wrote. about it. She said, there are many insights from our understanding of peer contagion in eating disorders and anorexia that may apply to the potential peer contagion of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Just as friendship cliques can set the level of preoccupation with one's body image, weight, and techniques for weight loss, so too may a friendship clique set a level of preoccupation with one's body image, gender, and techniques to transition. It cannot be disputed that there is a social aspect to the massive amount of young people identifying as trans these days. It's a fad. It's in vogue. It's popular. And so more are wanting to dabble in this area. Rob?
I have to agree with that. The social aspect of it, a lot of kids who are even rejected by the other sex turns to their own sex.
Yeah.
And they just, whether they've been shamed, whether they've been told, I'm not pretty enough, or whatever the cause, and that goes both male and female.
Yep.
And I feel that plays a factor in it also.
Yeah, I agree.
It's the social aspect for this sudden spike is huge. Let's turn to the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about these issues? Because this is the last segment of this first session. Because if we're talking about getting all of the facts, then we need to know where God lands on these issues. And let's start with homosexuality, and I'd say maybe the most infamous case in the Bible that is often brought up when it comes to homosexuality is Sodom and Gomorrah. If you don't know the story, it goes like this. Two men came into Sodom and they met Lot. And Lot asked them to come to his house, and he takes them to their house. And then the men of the city find out that there's these two guys, these two out-of-towners. And they come to Lot's house and they tell him, bring out the men so that we can have sex with them. This is in Genesis 19, by the way, if you want to check my work. Lot urges them, don't do this. Do not do this. But they basically bum rush him, and they go after the guys. Turns out, surprise, the two guys were actually angels. It strikes all of the men blind, and then eventually Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for their sin. The question is, though, what was their sin? In Ezekiel 16, verses 49 through 50, it tells of the sin of Sodom. It says this, behold, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did an abomination before me, so I removed them when I saw it. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, as much as we bring that forward to today, sodomy is a man having sex with another man. But in the story itself, there was actually no sex. It was just an attempted gang rape, which again is not good. You shouldn't be doing that. But using the story of Sodom and Gomorrah to show that, well, you see, this is obviously why they were condemned. According to Ezekiel, they were condemned for more than just that one reason. And it seemed like pride was at the top of the list. But that is not the only thing that the Old Testament has to say about homosexuality. I just wanted to go through that because a lot of people are like, yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's like, well, there was actually no homosexual acts going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, at least the story. We kind of get a sense of what was going on in the city by what these men wanted to do to the angels. But in Leviticus 18:22, this is clear and cut and dry.
You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. Homosexual sex is an abomination. Go a little further down in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. It says, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. And there are multiple other cases in the Old Testament that talks the similar language. It seems that God is pretty straightforward when it comes to homosexual acts. But what about Jesus? This is always the one that that gets brought up in this debate, in this conversation, because they say Jesus, Jesus never condemned homosexuality. And that's true to a point. He never talked about homosexuality. It never came up. My question would be, instead of viewing that as, well, he didn't address it, and so that gives me free reign to do it, that's a dangerous way to live. You follow that to its logical conclusion, and you're not going to end in a happy place. Why wouldn't Jesus address the sin of homosexuality? It's not the way that they on the other side of the debate would frame it, is that he was confronted with this question and he just wouldn't answer it. No, that's not how it was at all. He wasn't confronted with it at all. Probably because his typical audience that he was teaching were Jewish people that already had the law. And so the question of do you think homosexuality is good or bad, Jesus, it wouldn't even have come to their minds to ask that question, because the verses that we've already read, God is pretty determined and easy to translate that homosexuality is the acts are an abomination to him. It just wasn't an issue among Jewish people. An example of this might be, how many times have you heard your preacher preach a sermon on polygamy? You ever got that polygamy sermon? No. I've been preaching for 12 years, never preached on polygamy. Why? Because it's not an issue, right? Maybe if it was an issue, I'd preach on it, but it just isn't. So I've never preached on polygamy. I've never heard a sermon on polygamy. Maybe in other areas of the country, you might preach on it more, but nowhere I've been. But Jesus does affirm that marriage is between man and a woman. We're going to read it in a little bit here in Matthew chapter 19, but Jesus does affirm, this is what marriage should look like, and what it has looked like from the beginning, and it still is, and it is supposed to be going forward. Paul, though, is a different story. Paul talks about homosexuality a lot. Why is that? Paul's mission was to the Gentiles. And in the Gentile countries, homosexuality was widely approved of in their culture. And so it had to be addressed. So Paul talks about homosexuality all the time. We've already read that passage in Romans where it talks about the men giving up natural relations with women and instead burning with passion for each other. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 9 and 10 it says, "Or do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither is the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor greedy, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor swindlers will inherit the kingdom of God." Men who practice homosexuality. It's right there, it's listed. Or in 1 Timothy 1 verses 9 and 10, it says, "Understanding this, that the law was not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and the profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine." You put that all together, Old Testament, New Testament, several different parts in both. the Bible forbids homosexual sex. Probably not a shocker to anyone in here tonight. But what about the transgender issues? The problem is that there's no verse that says, if thy gender identity does not match thy biological sex, then thine body is who you really are. I wish there was. That would make it a lot easier. It'd make it, just as cut and dry as homosexuality, but there isn't. But the Bible does talk a lot about human nature and the importance of biological sex, and we'll run through these here before we are done with this first session. Of the most important arguments and verses to point out when it comes to transgender, Genesis 1:27 has to be the most important. It says this: "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." The body is essential to our image-bearing status. It's one of the most important passages, not just to this debate, but to a lot of things when it comes to understanding what we should be doing and how we should be living. And scholars have wrestled for years on what it means to bear God's image. Does it mean that, God's spiritual body looks like our physical body? Maybe. Does it mean that we are made in his image and that we have the same emotions? God gets angry, we get angry. God gets jealous, we get jealous. God experiences love, we experience love. Is it that? Or is it relational? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are one, and the one are three, and they are in perfect harmony and relationship with each other, and maybe that's why we crave relationship as human beings, because we're made in his image that way. Or is it spiritual? The fact that God is a spiritual being, and there's part of us, even though we are physical, that is also spiritual. God is eternal, and there's a part of us that is also eternal. Does it mean that? Is it any one of these four? Is it all four at the same time? I don't think we can be definitive or dogmatic on any one of these, but whatever the image of God points to, one thing is rather clear. Our bodies are essential to bearing God's image. The word here for image in Hebrew is selim, which every other place in the Bible always refers to idols. And what are idols? Well, they are visible representations of an invisible deity. And when you think about it, that's us, right? That's who we are as human beings. We are the visible representation of an invisible deity. Mark Cortez, the professor of theology at Wheaton College, had this to say about this verse, and I think it fits. It says, "The image of God is a declaration that God intended to create human persons to be the physical means through which he would manifest his own divine presence in the world." We are the visible representations of God on earth. And that representation that we read about in Genesis 1:27 was created as both male and female. Number two, male and female in Genesis 1 are categories of sex, not gender. These are not gender. How do we know that? Well, it's talking in the context, it's talking about reproduction. Because in the very next verse, in verse 28, he says, "Go, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." They're biological and for the use of reproduction. But I think in this, there's also something special that God is doing here, something very powerful. That many claim that Christianity is sexist and oppressive towards women. And I see the exact opposite here. In a world where women are often viewed as lesser beings, God declares from the beginning that his image is not only borne by males, but by females as well. It's not endowed by man, but by God. And so even though cultures have mistreated women throughout history, it was God's intent that they are no less image bearers than their male counterparts. Number three, Adam and Eve's bodies were viewed as sacred. In Genesis 2, verses 21 and 22, it says this: "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man." The word there for rib in Hebrew is sela. And it's used over 40 times in the Old Testament. Every other place that it's used, this is the only place that it's translated rib. Every other place that it's used, it's talking about the side of a sacred piece of furniture or a side room of the temple. Isn't that interesting? That how it's translated in the rest of the Bible kind of informs how it's being used here, that Adam and Eve's bodies were compared to sacred pieces of furniture. And then when we get to the New Testament, Paul takes that idea and just runs with it. How many times did Paul talk about our bodies being a temple, or that we're being built up into a temple? That our bodies are meant to embody God's presence, just like temples do. Number 4, Jesus views Genesis 1 and 2 as normative. In Matthew 19, Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees, and they ask him a question about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And this is how Jesus answers in Matthew 19, verses 4 and 5. It says, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And said, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Jesus considers God's original creation of humans as male and female thousands of years later to still be the normal way that God intended it. Number 5, Paul correlates the body as personhood. In 1 Corinthians 6, verses 19 and 20, see how many times Paul interchanges you and body in this one passage. It says, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body." Paul interchanges, for him, they mean the same thing. You and your body are the same thing. He does the same thing in Romans 6:13. It says, "Do not present your members," and he's not talking about church members here. He's talking about parts of your body, "to sin as instruments of unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness." For Paul, personhood is a body. And then finally, number 6. Scripture always prohibits cross-sex behavior. We've looked at a lot of these verses already. One that we haven't is Deuteronomy 22:5. It says, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak, but whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." Conclusion, before we take a break. Our sexed bodies play an essential role in determining who we are. Translation: being biologically male or female is part of our identity, and God wants us to use that identity to glorify Him. All right. We got through the information part. We're going to take 5 minutes, so come back when that clock says 6:41. And we'll get on with the second portion of this seminar.
know that being in counseling like you are, but to think that someone needed a controlled group, so they were just
Yeah.
experiment. Maybe he very much believed his theory, but he had to prove his theory.
Yeah.
But
Started with the second session. We're 4 minutes late. We're waiting on Erin to wrap up her conversation over here, you know. It wasn't me. It totally was not me. Also having a conversation. All right. Session 2. So like I said, session 1, it was just if you felt like, man, that was just like machine gun style rattling off facts and information, because it was. We needed to get through that so that we have a baseline of, all right, this is what it is. This is truth. This is facts. Now, what do we do with that? What are we supposed to do now? I'm going to say something, and then I'm going to prove what I just said, and then I'm going to say it again, and then I'm going to prove it again, and then I'm going to say it again. So if you're thinking like, man, Chris is just repeating himself here, it's not because I've ran out of stuff to say. It's because it matters. And this is the thing. You need to talk to your kids about sex and their sexuality early. I can't speak to the days before what we are currently dealing with now. But today, raising kids today, you need to teach them early, because if you do not, there are a variety of sources out there more than willing to teach them for you. And what they will teach them most likely will be both damaging and twisted from what God intended. Gender identity teaching in the schools today has been described as by some as, not me, but by others. Other people wrote this, but I don't think they're too far off, as described as cult grooming or ideological grooming. And before we start pointing the finger at teachers, we have several teachers in the room tonight. I've talked to several teachers in our school systems today, and many of them, they feel like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. What do you do? This is the curriculum. Do you not teach it and risk your job? Do you speak out to the school board and risk your job? In the name of inclusion, school health classes have become the mouthpiece and tempter for all things alternative lifestyle these days. But it's not just the school system, and I'm not here to bash public school tonight. It's not just them that is doing the damage. Pornography is an ever-growing sickness in our world today. And I'm going to rattle off some stuff here, some facts, some stats for those of us here in Cheyenne. Some of these, they won't be as shocking because I've already told you them. But here they are regardless. In the pornography industry, just one website, the self-proclaimed largest website, 42 billion individual visits a year. In 2016, so that was in 2019. That's when that stat was reported. In 2016, it was only 23 billion visits a year. And so in the course of 3 years, it doubled. And now we are 4 years removed from 2019. Who knows what we're up to now? Again, in 2019, there was, just in that year alone, there was 1.36 million hours of new content uploaded to just one site. I did the math. In order to watch just that year's new content, it would take you 169 years to watch. First exposure to pornography for our kids is happening younger and younger. Right now, For 10-year-olds and younger, 15% have seen it. When it goes up to 13 years old, over half have been exposed to pornography, and the average age of exposure is 12, and that number is it's dropping drastically. With how many kids have phones nowadays, and how many of them are unprotected, 71% of teens hide what they do online from their parents. That one's not too shocking, because teenagers, even if it wasn't online, kids have been hiding things from their parents forever. But the more troubling thing is that 76% of porn is consumed on phones. That is the primary way in which people, especially young people, watch and are exposed to pornography. Like I said, there are so many kids out there who have phones, and they aren't locked down, they're not filtered, there's no accountability software on there. They have free and unfettered access to the whole of the internet, which is a really scary thing. And even if your kid has a phone and you're like, hey, well, we're controlling this, we got accountability software on there, we've talked to them, we're doing all the things that we should be doing, you have to realize that pornography is introduced in the context of relationships. 50% of young people are introduced to pornography by a peer, meaning someone in their class, and 32% are introduced to pornography by someone older than them. That's 82% of people that have been exposed to pornography by being out on the playground at recess going, hey, look at this. And it can happen that quick. Even if your kid doesn't have a phone, they will still probably be shown pornography by one of their friends or an older kid at school. And the largest consumers of pornography today are kids ages 12 to 17. The damage of pornography addiction is far-reaching and has lasting effects into adulthood. But one effect in particular that is troubling regarding the subject matter that we're talking about tonight is the formation of what is called an arousal template. What is an arousal template? Basically, why do people like the things that they like? Why are certain things attractive to certain people and not attractive to other people? It's because, they've formed an arousal template which determines, this is what I like, this is what I'm into, this is the color of hair or the length of legs or the how muscular, how thin, how tall, how short. It's all their arousal template. And how an arousal template gets formed in a young person's life is basically the same way that we all learned English, if English is your first language. Right? Like we didn't, when you're 2 or 3, we probably didn't take classes. How did you learn English? You just learned it, right? Because everyone else around you was speaking it. They were told that is a cat, and then you practiced it, and then it was just like, it just becomes a part of who you are. You didn't really have to think about it. It just happened. And the same thing is true with an arousal template. It's typically either the first sexual experience a person has, or if there's a traumatic sexual experience a young person has, that kind of gets seared into a person's memory, into their neural pathways. And they say that nerves that fire together wire together. And so for me, for instance, my first exposure to pornography was a Playboy centerfold on the wall in an auto shop. And like, okay, that was, I saw it, it was dangerous, it was exciting, it was intriguing all at the same time. And what they say about arousal templates is that then is like, all right, that wired in my brain. Okay. And then that happens again and again and again and again. For me, and I would say most of us adults in here, that's probably how our first exposure to pornography happened, right? You saw a picture, right? And when you look at a picture, it has this many neural pathways that form. What they're finding is that when a picture might have this many neural pathways, whereas a video with full audio of people performing sex acts on each other, and typically are very what we would call hardcore stuff. That is typically what young people are first exposed to. And so you have more nerves that are firing and more nerves that are wiring together. You take that, that's bad enough. But when you realize that the type of pornography that these young people are consuming and then showing each other is oftentimes the most violent and dehumanizing types of pornography. We're starting to see this, well, we have been seeing it for maybe the last decade now, of the kind of the end game of this playing out on our college campuses. If you know, the amount of sexual assault on college campuses is every year they make a new high. It's just like going up and up and up and up and up. Why? Some researchers point to this arousal template. That young people, when their first exposure to pornography is something that is extremely violent and dehumanizing, and then they, in their heads, go, that's what sex is. That's what I'm supposed to do. And so then they go off to college and then they try it. And then they realize, oh, this is actually bad. You take that, and then you add in the fact that, again, one of the more consumed genres of pornography is homosexual or hermaphroditic sex scenes. Then you think that, like, if it's forming their arousal template, then they're being skewed, right? They're being pushed over into this, this is what is good. This is what I'm into. This is what is attractive to me. And many young people don't know what to do when they see these images and these videos. And so they hide it away. For those of us who have dabbled with sin in our lives, we know that hiding sin away, it doesn't just stay there, it doesn't go away. It festers, it spreads, it becomes shameful. And so then they're taught from a young age that sex and their sexuality is something to be hidden away. And they convince themselves that their parents wouldn't understand. And when a friend comes along and starts a conversation with them that is dangerous and taboo of a sexual nature, then that friend becomes their sexual confidant. And depending on that friend's sexual orientation or exposure, they will take your kid wherever they want to go. We talked about before of how much acceptance is important to young people. You say, well, why wouldn't you just, get rid of that relationship? Well, then I'm going to be on the outside. You need to talk to your kids about sex. Your house needs to become a safe place to talk about anything and everything. And I brought resources. I would highly encourage, especially you people that have young kids at home still, to come take a look at these. This one is the story of me. These are all Christian resources here. This is for kids age 3 to 5. And it just talks about God's plan for how mom and dad have babies, right? Ever had that conversation with your kids? Where do babies come from? If you're not comfortable with talking about sex or even saying the word to your children, and I have to admit, it's weird. Like talking to your kids about sex, and it's like, how does it work? Where does the stuff go, and how does it supposed to function? It's like, at least for me, maybe you guys are just pros at this, but for me, it's like, this is awkward. This is just so weird. But I didn't have these resources, but if I did, I would have used them, because looking through them, they are fantastic. This is called The Talk. 7 lessons to introduce your child to biblical sexuality. They encourage this to be done from anywhere from 6 to 10 years old. just talking about what sex is. They actually have anatomical drawings in here of genitalia, done in a respectful way, but also like, let's get educated. You know your equipment. This is the other person's equipment. The next one is changes. 7 biblical lessons to make sense of puberty. Why is your body changing? Why is hair growing there? What is going on in your body? If you feel awkward of like, how do I talk to my little angel-faced child about these things? They have a book. They suggest 8 to 12 for that. The next one is the Talk Relationships Edition. 11 lessons to give kids a greater understanding of biblical sexuality. And they suggest 11 through 14, so in those preteen ages. Again, they're going to be up here, so after we're done, please look through them. All of these are, I order them off Amazon. Easy. Some other resources. If you are interested in transgender issues, or just, this is not written from a Christian perspective, this is purely science of talking about why gender matters. And I think it's a really interesting take. I haven't read it yet. Alicia's been reading through it. I've just kind of perused because I don't get to read it until she's read it. Of the scientific evidence to talk about why it matters and why boys are different than girls. Living in a Gray World by Preston Sprinkle. Great resource. This is specifically written to teens. It's a Christian teens guide to understanding homosexuality. If you have a young person that might be struggling, or if your kid has a friend who has identified as homosexual, great resource. Mama Bear Apologetics. Even if you're not a mama, okay? This could very easily just say Daddy Bear on there too. I don't know why they said this should just be Bear Apologetics. It just talks about different lines of argumentation that are being used on young people today to convince them that Christianity is outdated. It's old. It's not informed. It's not based in reality. This book is a great resource to help you combat all of those things. Come take a look if you like when we're done. Different strategies for talking to your kids about sex. Like I said, we didn't have many of these resources, and so the strategy that Alicia and I used was basically not pushing them away when they would ask a question. I mean, kids as young as 3 or 4 ask, where do babies come from? Right? Especially if they're like witnessing mom get pregnant again, right? And it's like, whoa, what is happening here? Mom's belly's getting big. Did it just pop out through your belly button, or how does this stuff happen? And we would tell them at the age that they were able to understand. Like, we didn't bring out the anatomy books when they were 3 years old. We don't want to scar them. We scar them enough. But that's what we did. We actually talked with them. We did it the hard way. Whenever they asked the question, we wouldn't shy away from it. And if they didn't ask the question, then we would set kind of milestones in our head of like, okay, it's time to talk about whatever it is, pornography, masturbation. It's time to talk about, these things that are extremely awkward to talk about. Read a book. That's a strategy. Talk about anatomy. You can just bring out an anatomy book at the appropriate time and just talk about this is how God made bodies. And it shouldn't be something that's ashamed of. Talk about pornography. The way we did it was we didn't even use the word pornography. We just described what it was. There are some people who put pictures of themselves naked on the internet, and people look at it. And so if you ever see something like that, let me know. Because I want to talk to you about it, and to not make it scary, not make it shameful. You need to talk, because after the fact, the damage has already been done. And I'm not saying that you can't do it after the fact, but if we're going to pick one or the other, let's do it before, so that they're prepared, so that they're ready for when the kids on the playground or when the health class comes around, that they're not confused by anything or feel like they've been lied to. Let's talk preventative measures here, from a different angle. And let's start with the church. The church needs to foster better, more authentic, more life-giving communities for our teenagers. Many teens who fit the ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria narrative, are struggling with significant challenges in their lives. Anxiety, depression, self-harm, and some have experienced trauma and abuse, and most of them feel isolated. They feel alone. They feel like they can't talk to anyone, and most feel isolated and weighed down by social pressures. And one reason why young people often turn to online help is because they haven't found real community, real love, or authentic relationships elsewhere. And the church, we can play a part in this to do that. We need to be in the business of creating safe communities for our young people, where they feel like they can ask questions about transgenderism, ask questions about homosexuality, and not feel like they're going to be judged. And then we go to the home. Parents, we need to be aware of the daily lives of our kids. I have 3 teenagers and one 20-year-old that's out of the house now. And trying to keep up with them is exhausting. It's hard. It's extremely difficult. It's probably the most challenging thing that I've ever done. And having the conversations with them when they fail, when they disappoint us, having to discipline them, having to have talks, crying with them, hugging them, praying alongside them, trying my best to show them the love of Jesus. It is exhausting, and parenting is not for the faint-hearted. You say, like, talking about sex, that's awkward to talk about. Well, duh, right? But if you're not going to do it, who's going to do it? You need to have gender and sex conversations with your kids at a young age. And we need to allow for different ways for boys to be boys and girls to be girls. And we shouldn't be the ones demanding certain gender stereotypes of saying, well, if you don't play football, you're not a boy. You know, you're not a man. If you don't go hunting, you're not a man. We shouldn't be the ones that are reinforcing the messages that they're getting at school, that if our daughter wants to play football, it's like, well, she must be a lesbian. That should not be coming from our role in this. And number 3, the internet. We talked about this last year at this time. This is a whole nother thing. We're not going to go too far into it, but this is what you need to know. Excessive internet and social media use has been linked to the rise of anxiety, depression, and suicidality. And we all know that the internet is a hot mess when it comes to anything sexual, but that will likely be the first place that they turn to if they can't ask questions at home or at church. So talk to them about the internet. Talk to them about their phones. Talk to them about the software that is installed on their phones. Use the filters. Use the accountability software. And when they ask, well, why do we have to do this? This is so dumb. Not to respond with I pay for this whole thing, so you will do this. I've totally not responded that way. Ever, right? But then you come back
with the, hey, this is why. This is why we're trying to protect you. We're trying to be safe. And it's not just a kids thing. It's the mom and dad thing too. We want everyone, all of us, to be safe on the internet because we realize just what kind of cesspool it is. In short, you need to cultivate an environment of love and trust in the home and with your kids. My kid just told me they're gay. Now what? What do I say? What do I do? Well, here's the big two. The big two are this. Number one, listen. Don't react. You can't love someone unless you listen to them. They're probably scared out of their minds. They're probably confused. There are several accounts of LGBT teens coming out, and the most damaging thing that they said was that their parents and their friends didn't listen to them. They just responded, "What? You can't be gay? You already went on a date with this other guy." Or, "Not in my house." Or, even worse, "You're going to hell." There will be time for you to talk, but you first need to listen. Listen with compassion, even if they're yelling at you, even if they're cussing at you, even if they're raging out. Just listen. And number two, express your commitment to them. Let them know. Even say it out loud. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not afraid of you or what you're experiencing right now. I am here for you no matter what. The truth of the matter is that many same-sex attracted teenagers, for many of them, it's a phase. Don't tell them that, but it is. Statistics say that it's 20%. 20% of teenagers change their sexual orientation once or multiple times during their adolescence. The worst thing that you could do when a young person is going through a phase is cut off communication with them. It's hard as a parent to not step in and just make the changes in your kids' lives that you think that they should make. But if it's you making the change, it's not likely to last. And by overreacting, you could drive them even further away. So, the big two is listen and voice your commitment to them. And here are some points that you might touch on when you're in conversation with them. SSA is same-sex attracted teen. Number one, you're not an abomination. No matter how you felt about yourself or how others have made you feel, God doesn't think of you as an abomination or creepy or weird or disgusting. God delights in you. He cherishes you. He loves you. And it's true that God considers all sexual immorality to be a sin, but that also includes lust and porn, sex outside of marriage, and same-sex intercourse. That means we're all in the same boat. You're not an abomination. Number two, same-sex attraction is not a sin. The Bible makes a clear division between attraction and behavior. We are all going to be tempted in different ways, but the temptation itself is not sin. James 1:14 and 15, it says, "But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And when sin is fully grown, it brings forth death." Same-sex attraction is one of these desires that James is talking about that can lead to sin, but it is not sin by itself. Number three, you're not alone. Around 5% of the global population experiences same-sex attraction. And there's a good chance that there is someone at your church that has experienced this before. And maybe you've told your family and friends and now everything's just weird. They don't know what to say or how to act. And you get the sense that they'd rather just have you not be around. But there are others who feel exactly like you. Number 4, find someone to talk to. Maybe the better phrase would be find the right person to talk to. If the only people that you are talking to are people that are your age, then you need to get some wisdom. God hasn't wired us to figure out life on our own, so you need to find a mentor. And if you can't find a mentor, then you need to start praying that God would bring you a mentor. And adults, we need to become a safe person to talk to. If you or your children hear you rant and rave about trans issues and the homosexual agenda, do you think they are more likely or less likely to come talk to you? Number 5, you need to address it early. And as uncomfortable as it might be, some of us don't even like to say this word because we're so fearful of it. We need to help them banish the thought of suicide. 41% of trans people have attempted suicide. And 20% of gay or lesbian people have also attempted suicide. You can say something like, if you've thought about it, then you must have some deep pain or loneliness in your heart, and I want you to know that you're not alone. You need to find someone to talk to, or you can tell them, I would love to hear your story. And that's coming from me. I would love to hear your story. Suicide is not the solution. Those are some talking points if you're a parent talking to a teen, or maybe if it's your friend, some things that you can talk about. Overall, the answer to this growing epidemic of trans issues and homosexuality has to be one of love. Like I talked about from the beginning, many times when this category is brought up, our tendency can be one of outrage. But my answer that I want to present tonight, as I did in my sermon a few weeks ago, is one of love. Less outrage and more outrageous love. To love like Jesus did. There's one more book up here. It's called Gay Girl, Good God. It tells the story of the author, Jackie Hill Perry, that how she went from fully embracing masculinity and homosexuality with every fiber of her being. She was marching in gay rights rallies. She knew that she was same-sex attracted from the time she was 8. And she wasn't a Christian. She kind of hated Christianity. She hated God. But after encountering a man, so she does like spoken word poetry type stuff. And she met another artist. And they became close friends. He would then later introduce her to the love of God. They would eventually fall in love, and they're still married today. They have 2 kids. It's a fantastic story, especially if you have a young person who is struggling, to let them know that they're not alone. But it wasn't, here's the thing, going through the story, it wasn't sound argumentation that got her attention. It wasn't logic. It wasn't shame. It was love that brought her face to face with her Creator, the love of Jesus. See, Jesus wasn't pro-tax collecting, and yet tax collectors flocked to him. He opposed adultery staunchly, but he stood up for adulterers. Not their behavior, but their humanity. Jesus stood against sin, and yet sinners wanted to be in his presence. The marginalized,
the hurting, the shunned, all wanted to be around Jesus. Homosexual and trans-identified people often have several cards stacked against them. Mental health, loneliness, depression, abandonment, social stigma, and family rejection. And Christians, again, if we are honest with ourselves, we have several strikes against us just by identifying as Christian. We're known to be anti-gay, or very judgmental, hypocritical, anti-trans, anti-target, anti-this, anti-that, all of the things. Jesus was against many things, but somehow had a reputation for being for people. He had a clear ethical stance against sin and often spoke out against it, and yet was still able to draw to himself the very people who were found guilty by his words. And people need Jesus today. Trans people need Jesus. Gay and lesbian people need Jesus. We have to be the ones to bring Jesus to them. Less outrage and more outrageous love. That is all of my notes. We did it. I read everything in here. We're going to go into question and answer
time. And so if you have a question that we can talk about, I will admit up front, I am not the know-all, end-all, be-all when it comes to anything sexuality or trans-related. I have done a lot of research in this area, so I'll do my best to try to answer your questions, but if it's something that I don't know or not comfortable with spouting off an answer, then it might just have to wait. But, questions?
Yeah, I had a question. When you're reading, it is about the verse 1 Corinthians 6:9. When you're reading that, I noticed that the translation, it had one less term than a translation I'm using, the NASB. And I was just wondering, mine has in the middle, do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor homosexuals, nor thieves, etc. And it has two categories, effeminate, homosexual. I noticed when you're reading there is one. Do you know what? Is it one term or two terms?
Well,
Greek.
It's the ESV that I'm reading from.
Uh-huh.
And it's far superior to the. So let's just go with this. No, so the I believe in mine it was sexual immorality and men commit or practicing homosexual acts or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
The when mine breaks it down into men committing some homosexual acts, that is the effeminate that the NAS translates.
Okay. And then it skips. The NASB is either adding the nor homosexuals, or the ESV is skipping that term.
Maybe.
Do you know which?
I would have to look at the Greek.
Okay.
Which I have in my office. We go look at it after.
Okay. Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. I got a question that was texted into me. She says, will you be addressing what we're supposed to say when our gay best friend asks if they're going to hell? What do you guys think? If you have a friend who's gay and they ask you, well, am I going to hell? How do you answer that? Abigail?
Say anyone who doesn't have Jesus is going to hell. Doesn't matter if you're a liar, it doesn't matter if you're gay, it doesn't matter if you steal something, it doesn't matter if you're a murderer. Like, that sin isn't the issue, it's sin that's the issue.
I like that. I'm a preacher and I'm always looking for studies, so I would say, we should study about that. I just wouldn't, that was, preachers, we're sneaky like that, we just want to answer the question. I would just say, hey, we should study about that.
All right. If there's no other questions, then we're going to end our time. And like I said, parents, please come up and take a look at the resources. They are all, do not take the resources, they are mine. But like I said, you can easily get them on Amazon, except for the Why Gender Matters. I think that one might be more difficult to get your hands on. Let's pray, and then we will be dismissed from our seminar tonight. Dear Heavenly Father, God, thank you so much for this time that we've come together here and talked about some difficult things. God, I ask that you be with all of the parents that are in this room, all the grandparents that are in this room, as young people today have a difficult task ahead of them. God, I ask that you give them guidance and wisdom, that they can parent their children in the way that you would want them to. God, help us as parents to stand up in the face of whatever challenge comes our way, whether it be something about sexuality or anything, that we would realize that you have placed us in our kids' lives for a reason, and help us to show them you and your love in all that we do. God, thank you for your word, and thank you for your guidance through this and all things. We love you. It's in your Son's name that I pray. Amen.